be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, just a quick observation or two about what my colleagues from New Hampshire and Connecticut were just speaking to, and that is the issue of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I intend to talk about another subject, but as I was listening to their dialogue on that subject, there were a couple of things that I thought were important to respond to. They had indicated that there is a bill offered by Senator Menendez on their side of the aisle that they thought would get 90-plus votes here in the United States Senate. And I would say to my colleagues on the Democrat side that Senator Cruz, as he was advocating for a vote on his amendment, offered that up. He offered up a vote on Menendez and a vote on his amendment to Menendez, and that was turned down by the Democrat leadership. So that was put forward as an offer by the senator from Texas, Senator Cruz. And just to also make the point, this isn't something that is a new issue for him. He's been advocating on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline for years. And in fact, there were sanctions put in place during the previous administration, which I think had been quite effective. And with respect to holding State Department nominees, sometimes around here, you have to get people's attention in order to get a vote on something. I mean, he didn't have to hold nominees in the last administration because they allowed for a vote. In this administration, that's not been the case, and he's been trying for literally weeks and months, and I happened to be here into the wee hours of the morning a few weeks ago on a Friday evening when this was being discussed, and we were waiting for some agreement between him and the Democrat leadership about giving him a vote on this amendment. And ultimately, when he got the vote on his amendment, he turned loose 40-some nominees, State Department nominees. So I think he has, in this case, played fairly, played by the rules in the Senate, and exercised the leverage that he has as a United States Senator to ensure that he got a vote on an issue that's critically important, not only to him, I would say to this entire body, but to our country and certainly to our allies in that region. And one final point I'll make, and everybody was, as they were talking about this, saying, well, you know, this is all of a sudden, this issue's become a relevant one. Well, it's always been a relevant one. You know, defending and supporting people in Ukraine and making sure that they have a democratic government that allows for self-rule is something that I think all of us in this country want to see happen. But I think one of the reasons it's come to a head is because last year, or not last year, but 2 years ago in the previous administration, and senators from New Hampshire and Connecticut were going after Senator Cruz and other Republicans for not paying attention to this issue a long time ago. We have been paying attention to it for a long time ago, but one thing that has intensified that intention is the fact that the Russians now have tens of thousands of troops on Ukraine's border. That is a new issue, and an issue which I think demands the attention of this body, our country, our government, our State Department, and the American military in conjunction with our allies in that region. This is a critical time. It's very important that a strong message be sent, and I'm not sure why you would wait until after the Russians cross into the border and occupy Ukraine before you do something that might deter that kind of bad behavior. And I think the reason that they've amassed the troops that they have on the Ukrainian border is because they perceived a change in administration, perhaps a different view. And in fact, I think that buildup started in the spring of 2021 under this administration. So just to make the point that the vote that we will have this afternoon on Senator Cruz's proposal on Nord Stream 2 has been a long time in the making. He has, I think, consistently worked this issue, advocated for this issue in a way that any senator who is trying to get a vote around here would, and I think with respect to why this issue is now particularly relevant in light of our national security interests, it is the fact that the Russians do have literally tens of thousands of troops sitting on Ukraine's border at a time when the world is a very dangerous place, and that region in particular faces considerable peril because of the neighborhood in which they live. So I would hope that this afternoon, when this Nord Stream 2 vote comes up, that it will enjoy broad bipartisan support, recognizing the value and the importance of the message that it sends, and also, I might add, because it was also pointed out by the two senators who were just here that this is something that the Ukrainian government is asking us to do. They suggested this was something that isn't desired or wanted. It in fact is. Many of us participated in a conference call on Christmas Eve with President Zelensky at which he voiced support for this. And I think he and his country, his government, and his people realize how important it is that a message be sent to their neighbors, and that the American government, in concert with our allies in this region, sent a very strong statement with respect to that particular issue. So I hope that we get a good, strong vote this afternoon, and that it won't be a party line vote. It is at 60, meaning that it will take some Democrats to vote with Republicans, but I can't think of a time when the stakes have been higher for the people of Ukraine, or frankly, for that matter, for that region in its entirety. So, Mr. President, I want to shift gears now, if I might. Yesterday, we learned that in December, inflation hit its highest level in 40 years. 40 years. Inflation reached 7% in December, the seventh straight month that inflation has been over 5%. And today we discovered that year-over-year inflation for domestically produced goods increased even more by a massive 9.7%. Americans are struggling under steep increases in grocery prices, fuel prices, utility prices, and the list goes on. Despite wage increases in 2021, American families experienced a de facto pay cut, with their purchasing power shrinking thanks to inflation. And there's apparently no end in sight. Mr. President, given the real economic harm that American families are suffering as a result of this crisis, you'd think the issue would be front and center here in Washington for Democrats. But you'd be wrong. In fact, a lot of the time, inflation doesn't even seem to exist on Democrats' radar. Democrats can't be bothered to pay attention to a real crisis with real economic consequences for American families because they are too focused on their manufactured voting rights crisis. Earlier this week, President Biden traveled to Georgia, which has become Democrats' poster child for the supposed assault on voting rights, to deliver a speech to gin up support for Democrats' partisan election bill. And what a speech it was. In the course of his overwrought and bombastic remarks, the president, who once vowed to bring Americans together, managed to imply that half the country is racist. Never one to let the truth get in the way of a good story, he continued his bizarre habit of falsely claiming that he had been arrested in various situations. And he laid out perhaps the weakest case for a voting rights crisis that you can imagine. The president, of course, used Georgia's thoroughly mainstream 2021 election law as his main example. And here's what he had to say. Here's what the voting rights crisis in this country amounts to. First, according to the president, Georgia is making it harder to vote by mail. Now, I'm guessing he might be referring to the provision of the Georgia law that asks voters to write in their driver's license number on their absentee ballot. Given that almost every American in this country has a driver's license or some form of photo ID, I've got to say that it doesn't seem like an unduly burdensome requirement. After all, New York City and Washington, D.C. are now requiring you to present a photo ID and proof that you've been vaccinated before you can enter any restaurant or public place, and liberals seem okay with that. But apparently to the president, Georgia's measure is Jim Crow 2.0. The president continues by accusing Georgia of limiting drop boxes. Ballot drop boxes have become a bizarre fixation of Democrats engaged in trying to persuade Americans that the right to vote is under attack. The truth is, Mr. President, Georgia didn't even use drop boxes until the 2020 election, and that Georgia's new election law now requires at least one drop box in each county. Hardly a criminal attempt to restrict drop boxes. But let's be honest here. Even if Georgia decided to eliminate drop boxes entirely and return to its pre-2020 status quo, Georgians would still have ample opportunities to vote. Georgia's new law mandates a minimum of 17 days of early voting. 17 days. And Georgia provides for no excuse absentee voting, which means any Georgian Georgia citizen can request an absentee ballot for any reason whatsoever. That, of course, is a far more generous voting policy than those offered by the President or the Senate Democrat leaders' home states. The President's home state of Delaware doesn't offer no excuse absentee voting, and it is just starting to offer early voting this year. Remember, Georgia, 17 days early voting, no excuse absentee voting. Similarly, the Democrat leader's home state, Senator Schumer's home state of New York, offers just 9 days of early voting, in contrast to Georgia's 17. And New York, state of New York, on their ballot, recently rejected a ballot measure to allow no excuse absentee voting. So, no absentee or no excuse absentee voting, not allowed in New York, allowed in Georgia. 9 days early voting in New York, 17 in Georgia. And yet somehow, the President hasn't yet visited Delaware or New York to accuse them of making it difficult for citizens to vote. I'll believe in Democrats' supposed commitment to protecting the vote when I see the Senate Majority Leader come to the floor and excoriate New Yorkers for attacking voting rights. Continuing on with President Biden's speech, we come to perhaps the most ridiculous example the President and Democrats have used in their attempt to convince Americans that voting rights are under assault. And here I'm going to quote directly from the President's speech. The new Georgia law actually makes it illegal. Think of this, I mean. It's 2020 and now 22, going into that election. It makes it illegal to bring your neighbors, your fellow voters, food or water while they wait in line to vote. I mean, think about it. That's not America. That's not what it looks like. That's what it looks like, I should say, when they suppress the right to vote. End quote. That's what it looks like when they suppress the right to vote? Really? I mean, I have to give President Biden credit for delivering that line with a straight face, because that is pretty much the most absurd course of this debate. The President, of course, is referring to the provision in Georgia's election law that prohibits individuals or organizations from giving food or drinks to voters within 150 feet of a polling place. Now, just for purposes, again, Mr. President, of comparison and contrast, the Democrat leader's home state of New York, Senator Schumer's home state of New York, has a similar provision, preventing voters in line from being given anything, including food and water, whose retail value is in excess of $1. State of New York. State of New York. But people are blowing a gasket over this provision in Georgia law. Very provision state of New York has in law today. And I would argue most states, Mr. President, you can't go within a certain number of feet of a voting place if you're a political operative or a political organization. I mean, that's true in our state. I'm sure it's true in a lot of states around the country. And the aim of those laws, of course, is to prevent partisan political organizations or candidates from exerting improper pressure on voters in line. Now, nothing in Georgia's law prevents partisan political organizations from setting up food trucks or lunch stations outside of the 150-foot radius and feeding voters to their heart's content. 150 feet. That's 50 yards. And of course, Georgia's law explicitly allows nonpartisan poll workers to make water available to voters. So, election worker, somebody who's involved with the actual vote itself, can deliver water to voters if they're waiting in line. It just prevents political operatives and political organizations from doing that, Mr. President. A law that, again, is consistent with laws throughout the country, including the state of New York. But I suppose it's typical of nanny state Democrats to think Americans are incapable of packing themselves a snack. Mr. President, I'm pretty sure I've never seen a weaker case for a crisis. Take a look at Democrats' supposed evidence, and their case crumbles to dust, which is, of course, raises the question of what is behind Democrats' manufactured crisis. And unfortunately, I think we know the answer. Democrats have manufactured this supposed voting rights crisis in the hopes of forcing through election legislation that they hope will give them an advantage in future elections. More than one Democrat has openly admitted that Democrats want to pass a federal election takeover because they think it will help their party win elections. Mr. President, I don't blame Democrats for running scared. Between their inflation crisis, their border crisis, the president's humiliating, disastrous retreat from Afghanistan, the November election results in Virginia, and the fact that just 1/3 of the American people approve of the job the president is doing, Democrats have reason to be scared about their 2022 electoral prospects. But instead of addressing the inflation crisis they helped create, or perhaps moving their agenda from the far left closer to the center, Democrat leaders have decided that the solution to improving their electoral chances is to pass a partisan federal takeover of election law and to break the Senate rules to do it. Apparently they don't care what damage they do to the Senate and the country in the process. If Democrat leaders have their way, the long-standing protections for the minority in the Senate and the millions upon millions of Americans that the Senate minority represents will be swept away in the name of perhaps improving Democrats' electoral prospects. Although I have to say, Mr. President, in the Washington Post fact checker about the Georgia law, which, by the way, gave the president four Pinocchios, which is pretty much the biggest whopper you can get for his statements earlier or last year about this Georgia election law. They went on to say that the analysts who have looked at this, a lot of the analysis has been done by so-called election experts, think that it will expand the opportunity for people in Georgia to vote. Well, all of this is disheartening to say the least, because I think we all know that in the end, if you're going to blow up the Senate rules, that has consequences that go on for a very, very long time. There are Democrats in this chamber today who still express, I think, regret for what happened in 2013 with respect to the executive calendar, which deals with executive branch nominees and judicial branch nominees, judges, because it led to, in 2017, the Republicans retaliating, follow suit with Supreme Court justices. And I don't think you can assume for a minute that at some point this flips. If Democrats blow up the rules to do this and create, I have to say, a manufactured crisis in order to do it, then you're not going to be able to blame Republicans, because once the rules are gone, the rules are gone. And then we become the House of Representatives, a totally majoritarian body with longer terms. That's not what the founders intended, Mr. President. This place is here for a reason. It's here to represent the rights of the minority, the people who didn't win the vote, the people who might be in the minority party, who ought to have some say and some voice in the laws that are made here and the policies that are made here that are going to affect them and their families. I'm hopeful that there are still some Democrats with doubts about this course of action, enough perhaps to block their leadership's partisan push. Mr. President, in his inaugural address, the President of the United States vowed to be a president for all Americans. On Tuesday, he made it clear that he's becoming nothing more than a president for the far left wing of the Democrat Party. In less than a year, He's gone from promising unity to sowing division. It's a sad epitaph to a presidency that has barely begun. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.